The Chinese Civil War originally began in the 1930s, but kind of was put on hold between 1937 and 1945. It originally began as a civil war between Kuomintang, which is Chiang Kai-shek and his government, and Mao Zedong, who was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, or certainly became leader of the Chinese Communist Party after the Long March in the 1930s, which really cemented his power. After 1928 and the White Terror, in which up to 60% of the communists were killed, Mao kind of retreated with his communists across China and was desperately trying to avoid the nationalist government. After the Japanese aggression in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria, there was difficulty amongst the nationalist government in trying to get Chiang to not kill the communists, but to actually sort the Japanese out. And in 1937, the Japanese invaded with Nanking, and the rape of Nanking occurred. Now, Chiang Kai-shek immediately sent something like 6,000 men, and they got completely destroyed. However, this gained international support because it showed that the Chinese were not just simply pushovers. Anyway, after the Xi'an incident, excuse my pronunciation, where effectively Chiang's generals arrested him and forced him to sign a treaty with Mao, which called a truce to the civil war and made both sides try and help the Japanese. While Chiang's group actively fought the Japanese, Mao's group did more of a guerrilla warfare behind Japanese lines, but also Mao kind of ordered his followers not to engage the Japanese too much because, after all, we will need the ammunition after the war. In 1945, with the surrender of the Japanese, the civil war resumed effectively. Now, the US supported Chiang, and in fact, his Marines were able to airlift men across China in order so they could accept the surrender of the Japanese and not the CCP, because they were scared the CCP would use the Japanese against them. In 1946, after peace negotiations broke down, the civil war began again. However, because the Soviets now controlled Manchuria in northeast China, the communists now had a base in China in which they could use, because Chiang dare not upset the Soviet Union, because especially as he gained diplomatic recognition by the Soviet Union for his new government, from both the Soviet Union and obviously from the US. However, the problems with Chiang's regime was that there was a disturbing number of Japanese members that were joining the Kuomintang to fight, and also his regime was accused of being incredibly corrupt. A lot of US equipment that they'd got had gone missing, was simply destroyed, and Chiang prioritized loyalty over competence in his army, which was a huge problem. And over the course of the next 3 years, the communists began to win. Having got the base, they got a load of captured Japanese weapons, and the USSR began actively training Mao's guerrillas. So they became a much more disciplined fighting force. And as a result, in 1949, Chairman Mao becomes leader of China and results in starts a whole new set of policies. Now, there is argument on Atkinson's white paper that the Americans didn't do enough to prevent the flow of communism in China. Now, personally, I don't think they could have done anything else. The problems wasn't with the Americans. It was with Chiang's government being ineffectual. But the American public did not see it that way. And in particular, a man called Joseph McCarthy wonders how the US lost China. And Atkinson's white paper basically concludes that the Americans couldn't have done more for it. And that's what I agree with. I don't think they could have. Also, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Aid and Friendship was signed in 1950. And this is what gave aid to China. But it was really heavily skewed in terms of the Soviet Union in favour of the Soviet Union. Mao did not actually get a lot. He got a loan, and the USSR got effective mineral rights to a lot of China, which was another problem. Another thing that happened as a result of this was NSC 68, which is a document that proposed tripling America's defence budget to build up the US military to effectively combat and contain communism.